My name is John Chodacki, and I'm at the California Digital Library. As Ishwar was framing this panel at the very beginning, we are here to talk about the building and modernizing of the full data ecosystem as we look towards the implementation of the NIH data policy in 2023. And often when we talk about the data ecosystem, we are talking in terms of structures that are very jargony, very much segmented into different groups and different categories of repositories. And we talk about fair data, fair repositories. And what I wanted to talk about today was really about how to cut through some of that jargon and talk about how we can be much more clear about the type of norms and practices that we would like to see from repositories regardless of their type. And we can refer to this as fair repositories, or we can just refer to it as responsible repositories, but really just learn about how we can both build and modernize all types of repositories in the coming years to help create a baseline criteria for the upcoming data policy. So just to start off, wanted to just kind of do a little bit of discussion of terminology. The idea of a generalist repository versus a domain repository, obviously, this distinction is something that does matter. It is a reality, and but as we've just heard from the previous discussion, the idea of a generalist repository being somehow less than or somehow uninterested in the same types of issues as a domain repository is very much not the full story. Generalist repositories do definitely focus more on citability and creating meaning through the connections to other outputs, but domain repositories are those that are focused on one specific subject or model organism or other types. They are also very much interested in creating meaning more through deep metadata or through deep context. Regardless of what repository type it is, there is this common goal, which is to make sure that we can have enable reuse and make sure that we in the repository world are good stewards of the data that are uploaded into our systems. And so from this perspective, regardless of whether or not there is a generalist repository or domain repository at play, there needs to be a baseline criteria that really focuses on what is it that we are trying to get the technology and the systems and the communities behind the repositories to adopt. And I would say that these fit into four main categories. Ensuring that repositories are making connections between the data itself and the community's ontologies, as well as through other research outputs. Also to ensure that there is appropriate documentation, including not only just README files, but also just making sure that there's a standardized approaches across the entire repository landscape. That there's some level of curation and some level of technically checking the data set is available and appropriate, made appropriate for reuse. And the last being that there's some consistent way of focusing the governance side of the repository so that we understand how the repository itself will be sustained over time. So these four main criteria are what I wanted to just go through today and discuss. And really focusing on how this is, there's similarities across both domain and generalist repositories, and that there can be ways for both types to learn as we move forward. So the first category is really connections. So connections, are really the main value that many repositories have had for decades. So by this, we can mean persistent identifiers or connecting to the people and the places that research is being done. But also persistent identifiers are a way that signify not only what the data itself is, but also how the data is going to be stewarded long-term. So how do we, through the persistent identifier, we can really understand what type of stewardship policies and practices are being made available in that repository. Persistent identifiers and connections also allow us to help with tracking of the research data and help us show the context for which it was, through how it is connected to other things. It also allows us to start to become much more robust in our practices of creating metrics around and measuring the reach of research data. And in this space, we do see that generalist repositories have started to, in many ways, adopt a universal approach. Many are using DOIs as their main persistent identifier for identifying the data set itself, and also starting to use community-based approaches like ORCID for people or VORs for institutions. And in this space, we've also seen that domain repositories, while they do have a great strength in terms of deep context within their subject-based ontologies, they do still struggle sometimes because of the history, but sometimes because of the actual infrastructure, to find ways to build strategies that are universal in the same ways that the generalist repositories have been able to. And in this sense, it would be great for us to not just be critical of how generalist repositories have been able to come up to speed in the recent years, but also to look at how we can retrofit many of the domain repositories as they look to supporting the policies in 2023. The next category I wanted to discuss is just documentation. So this can be something as simple as a README file, or it can be something as an executable file. But really what we're trying to do in the repository world is focus on how researchers can show their work, how they can describe the work that they were doing to themselves, to their fellow researchers, to the wider community now and in the future, and really for us to be able to help build context. And in the generalist world, this is very muddled. There's different approaches at different repositories, different places doing different things. But I would say that the same is true within the domain repository world. There are README files and executable files, and there are ways for people to create virtual environments to crunch data. But in many ways, this is a do-it-yourself space, no common approach to documentation across repositories. And I think that is something that is definitely needed as we move forward with trying to implement the NIH policy. Furthermore, curation, or just having people at the repositories that have eyeballs on the data. This can be framed in different ways. It can be framed as what is the acceptance criteria, or what is the conversation that is happening around the data sets as they're being submitted and published. The value with curation is not just quality control. It's not just the technical checking of data submissions, but it's also ensuring that the researchers themselves are involved in the process, and that repositories don't become dumping grounds of of anything, but also are places for education and communication between the repository and the researcher. It also is something that ensures the documentation and ensures that we can build good connections, as I was just mentioning. And in the generalist world, we just don't really have that many repositories that are focusing on this value. And so it'd be great for us as we move up into 2023 for us to be focusing on generalist repositories, making more effort around offering curation, and also for domain repositories to be focusing not just on the human curation, but also on the connections to the rest of the scholarly communications world. So thinking about how domain repositories really do need to focus on connections into the journal world and the preprints world and other data and institutional repository worlds, and making sure that the curation practices are beyond their repository walls. One final common criteria that I want to discuss is governance. So, many repositories look towards the communities that they work within to help build governance approaches. Many offer open governance, and the community itself is involved in the way that the repository is run. This close collaboration is how repositories build trust, and how they build community, and how they build quality within the repository. Other signifiers, of course, to the communities around quality and trust are around openness, around open sourcing of the technology, or open community norms around governance. And one framework that exists in this space is the principles of open scholarly infrastructure, which is available at openscholarlyinfrastructure.org. And it's really a framework that looks at how do organizations like data repositories govern themselves? How do they focus on and communicate the sustainability efforts that they have? And what kind of insurance do they have or have they given to the community that they will be around long term? So generalist repositories and domain repositories both struggle in this sense that, domain repositories do have great community-based models usually, while generalist repositories are very different from place to place. Some have commercial interests, others don't have long-term sustainability plans, others rely heavily on institutions for their governance without real accountability to the researchers themselves. So, I mean, in general, one important common characteristic and criteria that would be great to see across all repositories is a common understanding and framework for how we describe the ideal governance for repositories. And I think that through this baseline criteria, some sort of common criteria, we can remove some of the jargon that we've been putting in place of this us versus them or generalist versus domain, and really starting to think about how we build a common understanding of what best practice is across the entire repository network. And some can call this publishing practices or curation practices or fair repositories, but really what I'm referring to here is the need for us to stop the segmentation along the specific lines of general versus domain, and make sure that we have a baseline criteria across the board.